1.5%. That is roughly how much of your daily energy your body pulls from fermentation happening inside your own gut right now. Deep in the rainforests of Central Africa, a primate carrying almost the same genetic code as you may be pulling more than half its daily energy from that exact same process, using a system your own body still carries but rarely puts to work. Not from meat, not from sugar, from fiber broken down by trillions of microbes living inside a chamber of its own intestine. Stay with this story, and that gap between 1.5% and 50% will stop sounding like an animal fact and start sounding like a question about your own body, one you will not be able to the next time you look at a plate of vegetables. Most people think of fiber as roughage, something that moves food along, keeps digestion regular, and otherwise does very little of interest. It sits in the same mental category as drinking enough water, useful, unglamorous, easy to ignore. That belief is not entirely wrong, but it misses almost everything important. Fiber is not simply passing through your body untouched. In the final stretch of your intestines, it becomes fuel for an entire ecosystem of bacteria, and what those bacteria produce in return changes your biology in ways that have nothing to do with bowel movements. Here is what is actually happening. Most of the fiber you eat cannot be broken down by human digestive enzymes. Your body simply does not have the tools for it, so that fiber travels largely intact all the way down to your large intestine. Waiting there are hundreds of species of bacteria, and for them that fiber is not waste. It is dinner. Through a process called fermentation, these microbes break the fiber apart and release a set of small molecules called short-chain fatty acids. There are three main ones worth knowing: acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Think of them as a kind of chemical currency, minted inside your gut and spent throughout your body. Butyrate alone is the primary fuel source for the cells lining your colon. Without enough of it, those cells begin to run on a kind of metabolic scarcity, even while the rest of you appears to be eating enough. These short-chain fatty acids do not stay local. They interact with receptors on cells throughout your body, including ones called GPR41 and GPR43, which link gut fermentation to immune activity, metabolism, and inflammation control. In other words, what your bacteria eat for dinner ends up influencing systems far outside your digestive tract. But here is the strange part. In a typical Western diet, this entire process contributes only a sliver of daily energy, somewhere around 1%. Your gut has the machinery for a much bigger operation. It is simply running on a fraction of its capacity. To understand why, we need to look at an animal whose gut is not running on a fraction of anything. Picture a clearing in the forests of the Congo Basin. A male western lowland gorilla, close to 400 pounds, sits surrounded by stems, leaves, bark, and pith, plant material most animals would struggle to extract any real nutrition from at all. He is not snacking. This is breakfast, lunch, and dinner, hour after hour structural plant fiber that would pass through a human digestive system largely unprocessed. And yet this animal is not underfed. Researchers studying the nutritional composition of the Western lowland gorilla diet concluded that the colon likely plays a major role in its overall energy budget, driven by fermentation on a scale far beyond anything in human digestion. One frequently cited estimate places the figure at around 57% of a lowland gorilla's metabolizable energy coming from short-chain fatty acids produced through fermentation. Compare that to the roughly 1.2% estimated for a Western human diet, and the difference is not incremental. It is a difference in kind. That is not a small dietary quirk. That is an entirely different metabolic strategy, built around a digestive system engineered to run on fermentation the way a car engine runs on fuel injection. But that is not the strangest part. The gorilla's reliance on this system is not constant. It shifts with the seasons. When fruit is abundant, gorillas eat more of it, and their diet looks closer to what people imagine when they picture a fruit-eating primate. When fruit becomes scarce, something remarkable happens. Field studies tracking wild western gorillas found that during low fruit seasons, they shift toward fibrous fallback foods, leaves, stems, and pith, and despite those foods being lower in energy density, the gorillas are able to maintain stable daily energy intake. Their hindgut fermentation system compensates for the drop in food quality by extracting more usable energy out of foods most animals would consider poor. Their gut does not just tolerate fiber. It depends on it, and it scales up to meet the moment when better food is unavailable. What researchers found next changed the picture even further. This is not just a stable trait, it moves with the seasons at the microbial level too. Studies tracking gorilla gut microbiomes across the year found that microbial composition itself shifts in step with fruit scarcity and fibrous fallback feeding, almost like the ecosystem inside the gut is recalibrating itself to match what is available outside it. That kind of flexibility is worth sitting with for a moment. This is not a fixed machine running the same program every day. It is a living system constantly adjusting its own internal population of bacteria to match the raw material coming in from the forest floor. The gorilla is not simply eating fiber. Its gut is negotiating with its environment in real time, season after season, and has been doing so for millions of years. This is not a new question for science either. Decades ago, researchers comparing digestion in chimpanzees and humans began treating great ape fiber processing as a serious scientific problem rather than a passing curiosity, laying groundwork for exactly the kind of comparison being made here. What started as a niche corner of primate biology has since grown into an entire field connecting digestion, microbiology, and human health. Now bring that back to the human body. If a colon like this exists in a close evolutionary relative, the question becomes obvious. Does the human gut still have any of this capacity, or was it lost somewhere along the way? The honest answer is more interesting than either extreme. Humans have not lost the biological hardware. Research comparing gut microbiomes across primates has found that humans still carry many of the same butyrate-producing bacterial pathways found in non-human primates, despite enormous differences in diet. The wiring is still there. What has changed is the fuel supply. This is where a common claim needs correcting. It is easy to hear a statistic like 57% and assume the lesson is simple: eat enough fiber and your gut microbiome will transform, and that transformation will directly translate into a calmer mind or sharper thinking. That claim circulates constantly and it sounds satisfying. It is also more confident than the actual research supports. In one controlled human study, participants switched to a high-fiber, whole-food diet for 2 weeks. Researchers tracked what happened inside their gut microbiomes in real time. The microbiome changed measurably and quickly. Certain fiber-fermenting bacteria increased within days. But when researchers measured short-chain fatty acids in stool samples, the levels did not shift in any consistent pattern. That result matters more than it might seem. It tells us that a changed microbiome does not automatically mean a changed metabolic output, at least not one that shows up cleanly in the measurements available. The gut can be actively reorganizing itself in ways the numbers do not fully capture yet, either because the fermentation products are being absorbed and used before they ever reach a stool sample, or because 2 weeks is simply too short a window for the full system to stabilize. The more precise and more honest version of the claim is this: fiber can reliably reshape which bacteria are present in your gut, often within days. What that shift means for your downstream biology, including mood and cognition, is still an open and active area of research, not a settled outcome. That is a less flashy claim, but it is the one the evidence actually supports, and understanding that distinction is what makes a person able to separate real science from wellness marketing. So if the biological hardware for fermentation still exists in the human body, the next question is evolutionary. Why did gorillas keep leaning into this system while humans moved away from it? The answer starts with body size and diet strategy. Gorillas are large-bodied primates that eat enormous volumes of low-quality, fiber-dense plant material for most of the year. When your food source is abundant but sparse, evolution favors a digestive system built to squeeze maximum energy out of that sparseness. A large, slow, fermentation-heavy hindgut is the biological answer to an ecological problem. How do you thrive on a diet most animals cannot use efficiently? This kind of trade-off shows up across the animal kingdom, not just in gorillas. Broader comparative research on vertebrate digestion has long shown that when an animal's diet leans heavily on structural plant material, evolution tends to respond with some version of a fermentation chamber, whether positioned early in the gut like in cattle or late in the gut like in gorillas and horses. The location differs. The underlying logic does not. Fiber-heavy food requires microbial help, and evolution keeps arriving at that same solution independently, across completely unrelated branches of the animal family tree. Humans faced a different set of pressures. At some point in our evolutionary history, the genus Homo began shifting toward a broader, more energy-dense diet. That shift likely included more animal tissue and eventually the use of fire and food processing, which unlocked calories that would otherwise have required a massive fermentation chamber to extract. This does not mean early humans avoided fiber. The available evidence suggests ancestral diets almost certainly contained substantially more indigestible plant material than a typical diet today, even if they never resembled a gorilla's intake. Humans did not abandon fermentation. They simply stopped depending on it as their primary energy strategy because other sources of energy became available that did not require it. That evolutionary trade-off made sense for most of human history. The problem is what happened next, because modern life did not just reduce our reliance on fermentation. It nearly eliminated the fuel that process depends on. This is where the story becomes less about ancient biology and more about the plate in front of you tonight. National dietary surveys show that the average American adult consumes somewhere around 17 grams of fiber per day. Recommended intake sits at 25 grams per day for women and 38 grams per day for men. Put another way, roughly 94% of Americans fail to meet even the baseline recommendation. That is not a minor shortfall spread across a small portion of the population. That is nearly the entire country running a digestive system built for fermentation on a fuel supply far below what it evolved to expect. Your colon still has the microbial workforce capable of producing short-chain fatty acids. What it often lacks is the raw material to do the job at scale. It is less like losing a factory and more like operating one at a fraction of capacity because the delivery trucks stopped showing up. Food processing accelerated this shift more than most people realize. Refining grains, juicing fruit instead of eating it whole, and stripping skins and stalks from vegetables all remove exactly the structural plant material fermentation depends on. None of these changes happened because anyone set out to undermine gut fermentation. They happened because processed and refined foods are easier to produce, transport, and eat quickly, and the fiber content was simply collateral damage of convenience, not a targeted decision. This mismatch plays out quietly in daily life. It shows up as digestive discomfort many people treat as normal. It shows up in how quickly someone feels hungry again after a low-fiber meal, because fiber slows digestion and supports the kind of steady, gradual energy release that fermentation depends on. It shows up in the growing scientific interest connecting gut health to mood regulation, immune function, and metabolic health, areas of active clinical research precisely because the underlying biology is so interconnected. There is a psychological layer here too. The relationship between gut and brain runs in both directions. Chronic stress can alter gut motility and the environment bacteria live in turn, the metabolic byproducts of that gut environment appear to feed back into systems involved in mood and stress regulation. The body does not treat digestion and emotion as separate departments. They are wired into the same communication network, and short-chain fatty acids appear to be one of several signals traveling along it. Epidemiological research examining large groups of adults has found that higher fiber intake is associated with lower rates of reported depression, with the association growing stronger as fiber intake increases. One analysis found that each additional 5 grams of daily fiber intake was associated with roughly a 5% lower likelihood of depression in adults. That is a real and consistent pattern worth taking seriously. It is not on its own proof that fiber directly treats or prevents depression, because association in large population studies cannot fully separate fiber intake from the dozens of other lifestyle factors that tend to travel alongside it, like overall diet quality, physical activity, and food access. Interestingly, the same body of research found the evidence connecting fiber to anxiety specifically was too limited to draw firm conclusions at all. A reminder that mood and anxiety, while related, are not interchangeable outcomes in the body. So what does an evidence-based person actually do with all of this? The most defensible action is straightforward. Increase fiber intake gradually through whole foods, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, and fruit, rather than treating fiber as a single interchangeable nutrient. Not all fiber behaves the same way inside the gut. Some ferments quickly, some slowly, some barely at all, and the specific mix in whole foods tends to feed a broader range of bacterial species than an isolated supplement. Think of it the way a city power grid draws from multiple sources rather than a single plant. A grid running on coal, gas, and hydro together is more resilient than one depending on a single source. A gut fed by many different fiber types, from beans to oats to leafy greens, gives its bacterial population more variety to work with than a diet leaning on one fiber source alone. Variety, not just volume, appears to matter to the ecosystem being fed. Gradual increases matter for a practical reason too. A gut that has spent years underfed on fiber has a smaller population of the bacteria best equipped to process it. Introducing a large amount all at once can lead to bloating and discomfort, not because fiber is harmful, but because the workforce needed to process it efficiently has not yet had time to grow to meet the new supply. It is worth expecting the microbial shift before expecting a subjective one. Research suggests gut bacteria can respond to increased fiber within roughly 2 weeks. A change in mood, focus, or energy, if it comes at all, is a slower and far less predictable outcome, and framing it otherwise sets people up for disappointment over something that was never promised by the underlying research. And here is the necessary caveat, spoken plainly rather than buried in fine print. No amount of fiber will turn a human digestive system into a gorilla's. The two systems differ in scale, anatomy, gut transit time, and millions of years of separate evolutionary pressure. The gorilla is not a diet plan. It is a demonstration, a living example of what a primate body looks like when its fermentation system is running near full capacity, offered here as a comparison to understand human biology more clearly, not as a lifestyle to imitate. What the research actually supports is more modest and in its own way more useful. Fiber is a lever you can pull with real measurable effects on your internal ecosystem. What that ecosystem does with the raw material you give it is still being mapped in real time by ongoing research, not a settled science with all its conclusions already written. There is also a quieter finding worth sitting with. Some recent research into the gut bacteria of people living in industrialized countries has identified previously overlooked cellulose-degrading bacterial diversity, evidence that even heavily processed modern diets have not fully erased the fermentation capacity built into the human gut over millions of years. The system, it seems, is more resilient than the average modern plate would suggest, quietly persisting even when it is rarely called upon to do much work. So return for a moment to that number from the very beginning. Less than 1.5% of your daily energy currently comes from fermentation happening inside your own body. Not because your biology is broken, and not because that capability was ever lost, but because the fuel supply feeding it has quietly shrunk across generations of modern eating. Somewhere in the forests of Central Africa, a close evolutionary relative is running that same internal system at a scale most humans will never come close to, not through some exotic biological trick, but simply by eating the way its ancestors always have. Current evidence suggests the human version of that system is not gone. It is dormant, waiting on a supply chain that stopped keeping up with what the body was originally built to run on. Your gut was never missing the workforce, it was only ever missing the work.